misfortune, and in a state of austere and melancholy grief on account of the loss of her husband. Instead of forgetting her sorrows as she ought to have done, and returning calmly and peacefully to the duties and enjoyments of life, she had given herself up to inconsolable grief, and was doing all she could to perpetuate the mournful influence of her sorrows. She lived in an ancient and gloomy mansion of vast size, and she had hung all the apartments in black, to make it still more desolate and gloomy, and to continue the influence of grief upon her mind. Here the Queen Dowager found her, spending her time in prayers and austerities of every kind, making herself and all her family perfectly miserable. Many persons at the present day act under such circumstances on the same principle and with the same spirit, though they do not do it perhaps in precisely the same way. One would suppose that Mary's mother would have preferred to remain in France with her daughter and her mother and all her family and friends, instead of going back to Scotland, where she was, as it were, a foreigner and a stranger. The reason why she desired to go back was that she wished to be made Queen Regent, and thus have the government of Scotland in her own hands. She would rather be Queen Regent in Scotland than a simple Queen Mother in France. While she was in France, she urged the king to use all his influence to have Arran resign his regency into her hands, and finally obtained writings from him and from Queen Mary to this effect. She then left France and went to Scotland, going through England on the way. The young King of England, to whom Mary had been engaged by the government when she was an infant in Janet Sinclair's arms, renewed his proposals to the Queen Dowager to let her daughter become his wife. But she told him that it was all settled, that she was to be married to the French prince, and that it was now too late to change the plan. There was a young gentleman about 19 or 20 years of age who came from Scotland also, not far from this time, to wait upon Mary as her page of honour. A page is an attendant above the rank of an ordinary servant, whose business it is to wait upon his mistress, to read to her, sometimes to convey her letters and notes, and to carry her commands to the other attendants who are beneath him in rank, and whose business it is to actually perform the services which the lady requires. A page of honour is a young gentleman who sustains this office in a nominal and temporary manner for a princess or a queen. The name of Mary's page of honour, who came to her now from Scotland, was Sir James Melville. The only reason for mentioning him thus particularly, rather than the many other officers and attendants by whom Mary was surrounded, was that the service which he thus commenced was continued in various ways through the whole period of Mary's life. We shall often hear of him in the subsequent parts of this narrative. He followed Mary to Scotland when she returned to that country, and became afterward her secretary, and also her ambassador on many occasions. He was now quite young, and when he landed at Brest he travelled slowly to Paris in the care of 2 Scotchmen, to whose charge he had been entrusted. He was a young man of uncommon talents and of great accomplishments, and it was a mark of high distinction for him to be appointed page of honour to the Queen, although he was about 19 years of age and she was but 7. After the Queen Regent's return to Scotland, Mary went on improving in every respect more and more. She was diligent, industrious, and tractable. She took a great interest in her studies. She was not only beautiful in person, and amiable and affectionate in heart, but she possessed a very intelligent and active mind, and she entered with a sort of quiet but earnest enthusiasm into all the studies to which her attention was called. She paid a great deal of attention to music, to poetry, and to drawing. She used to invent little devices for seals, with French and Latin mottoes, and, after drawing them again and again with great care, until she was satisfied with the design, she would give them to the gem engravers to be cut upon stone seals, so that she could seal her letters with them. These mottoes and devices cannot well be represented in English, as the force and beauty of them depended generally upon a double meaning in some word of French or Latin, which cannot be preserved in the translation. We shall, however, give one of these seals which she made just before she left France to return to Scotland, when we come to that period of her history. The King of France and the lords and ladies who came with Mary from Scotland contrived a great many festivals and celebrations in the parks and forests and palaces to amuse the Queen and the 4 Marys who were with her. The daughters of the French king joined also in these pleasures. They would have little balls and parties and picnics, sometimes in the open air, sometimes in the little summer houses built upon the grounds attached to the palaces. The scenes of these festivities were in many cases made unusually joyous and gay by bonfires and illuminations. They had water parties on the little lakes, and hunting parties through the parks and forests. Mary was a very graceful and beautiful rider, and full of courage. Sometimes she met with accidents which were attended with some danger. Once, while hunting the stag, and riding at full speed with a great company of ladies and gentlemen behind her and before her, her dress got caught by the bough of a tree, and she was pulled to the ground. The horse went on. Several other riders drove by her without seeing her, as she had too much composure and fortitude to attract their attention by outcries and lamentations. They saw her, however, at last, and came to her assistance. They brought back her horse, and smoothing down her hair, which had fallen into confusion, she mounted again, and rode on after the stag as before. Notwithstanding all these means of enjoyment and diversion, Mary was subjected to a great deal of restraint. The rules of etiquette are very precise and very strictly enforced in royal households, and they were still more strict in those days than they are now. The king was very ceremonious in all his arrangements, and was surrounded by a multitude of officers who performed everything by rule. As Mary grew older, she was subjected to greater and greater restraint. She used to spend a considerable portion of every day in the apartments of Queen Catherine, the wife of the King of France and the mother of the little Frances to whom she was to be married. Mary and Queen Catherine did not, however, like each other very well. Catherine was a woman of strong mind and of an imperious disposition, and it is supposed by some that she was jealous of Mary because she was more beautiful and accomplished, and more generally beloved than her own daughters, the princesses of France. At any rate, she treated Mary in rather a stern and haughty manner, and it was thought that she would finally oppose her marriage to Francis, her son. And yet Mary was at first very much pleased with Queen Catherine, and was accomplished to look up to her with great admiration, and to feel for her a very sincere regard. She often went into the Queen's apartments, where they sat together and talked, or worked upon their embroidery, which was a famous amusement for ladies of exalted rank in those days. Mary herself at one time worked a large piece, which she sent as a present to the nuns in the convent where she had resided, and afterward, in Scotland, she worked a great many things, some of which still remain, and may be seen in her ancient rooms in the palace of Holyrood House. She learned this art by working with Queen Catherine in her apartments. When she first became acquainted with Catherine on these occasions, she used to love her society. She admired her talents and her conversational powers, and she liked very much to be in her room. She listened to all she said, watched her movements, and endeavored in all things to follow her example. Catherine, however, thought that this was all a pretense, and that Mary did not really like her, but only wished to make her believe that she did so in order to get favor, or to accomplish some other selfish end. One day she asked her why she seemed to prefer her society to that of her youthful and more suitable companions. Mary replied, in substance, the reason was, that though with them she might enjoy much, she could learn nothing, while she always learned from Queen Catherine's conversation something which would be of use to her as a guide in future life. One would have thought that this answer would have pleased the Queen, but it did not. She did not believe that it was sincere. On one occasion Mary seriously offended the Queen by a remark which she made, and which was at last incautious. Kings and queens, and, in fact, all great people in Europe, pride themselves very much upon the antiquity of the line from which they have descended. Now the family of Queen Catherine had risen to rank and distinction within a moderate period, and though she was, as Queen